Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. The presence of U.S. military officials in Ukraine at a moment when Donald Trump signals a new peace initiative is not accidental. It is symptomatic of a deeper structural reality. The United States is exhausted politically, strategically, and fiscally by a conflict that has delivered diminishing returns and escalating risks. After nearly 3 years of intense engagement, Washington is experiencing what I would call strategic fatigue, a cyclical phenomenon in American foreign policy, wherein the initial zeal of intervention gives way to the sobering arithmetic, costs, consequences, and domestic political backlash. The United States entered the Ukraine war not as a participant, but as an architect of Ukraine's defense posture, confident that overwhelming financial and military support could deter or pressure Russia without the need for direct confrontation. Yet the fundamental miscalculation lay in underestimating both the resilience of Russia's economy and Moscow's ability to recalibrate its military-industrial capacity. While Washington expected sanctions to cripple the Kremlin, the opposite occurred. Russia pivoted toward Asia, the Middle East, and the global South, reshaping the world's energy and financial flows in ways that the U.S. could not easily counteract inside the U.S. This has produced a growing sentiment on both the populist right and progressive left that the American public is being asked to underwrite a conflict with no clear endpoint, no coherent strategy, and no meaningful prospect of decisive victory. This is the environment in which Trump's emerging peace plan is taking shape. Whatever one thinks of Trump, his political instincts are attuned to fatigue. He recognizes that the American electorate no longer sees the Ukraine war as a strategic priority, but rather as an expensive, poorly justified burden. Thus, when U.S. military officials appear in Ukraine today, they are not merely coordinating logistics, they are evaluating the limits of American commitment. They are confronting realities that policymakers in Washington have avoided for too long, that the current trajectory is unsustainable, that Ukraine's battlefield prospects are diminishing, and that a negotiated settlement is no longer a diplomatic afterthought. It is becoming an economic and political necessity. Trump's message, therefore, lands on fertile ground. His argument is not complex. The United States must pivot from escalation to negotiation, from open-ended commitments to tangible diplomatic outcomes. And while critics say he oversimplifies his core proposal, aligns with the truth, Washington has resisted, acknowledging this war will end at the negotiating table, not on the battlefield. In this sense, Trump's peace plan is less a novelty and more an overdue recognition of geopolitical facts. It is precisely because the U.S. is tired, overstretched, and increasingly aware of the global costs of prolongation that his proposal carries political weight. The question now is not whether America is fatigued, it clearly is, but how that fatigue will shape the next phase of transatlantic strategy and how Europe, Russia, and Ukraine will respond. To understand Trump's emerging peace strategy for Ukraine, we must revisit his first term, not through partisan mythology, but through a sober analysis of outcomes. Trump did not end any major war, but he did something that Washington's foreign policy establishment rarely tolerates. He avoided starting new ones. That alone, given the historical drift of American global interventions, was significant. More importantly, Trump's approach to Russia and Ukraine during his first term illuminates the framework he is now attempting to revive. 1. Strategic restraint with Russia. This skepticism did not reduce tensions entirely, but it did limit escalation. During Trump's tenure, U.S.-Russia relations were tense but stable. No new sanctions, explosions, no direct military entanglements, no proxy war spiraling into a continental conflict. 2. Ukraine's conflict contained, not escalated. Under Trump, the Donbass conflict remained localized and static. There was no sweeping Russian military operation, no large-scale mobilization, and no NATO-Ukraine deep integration that might provoke Moscow's red lines. This does not mean Trump solved the conflict. Rather, his instinct for non-interventionism unintentionally kept the conflict from boiling over. His administration viewed Ukraine not as a launching pad for geopolitical confrontation, but as he repeatedly emphasized a regional issue requiring negotiation rather than expansive U.S. entanglement. 3. Skepticism of the NATO bureaucracy. Trump's criticism of NATO was widely mocked, but it had a kernel of truth. Europe had become overly dependent on U.S. funding and security guarantees. While Trump's rhetoric was abrasive, his larger message was strategic. Europe must take responsibility for its own security. Ironically, this message resonates even more strongly today. The war in Ukraine has revealed that Europe's capabilities are far weaker than advertised, and that U.S. support is the essential pillar of Ukraine's defense. This imbalance is precisely what Trump leverages today. If Europe wants the war prolonged, it must fund and manage it. If not, negotiation becomes inevitable. 4. A transactional vision of peace. Trump's diplomatic worldview has always been transactional. In his calculus, peace is not built on ideological alignment, but on bargaining, space territory, sanctions, political guarantees, and economic incentives. Many diplomats find this crude, but it is also pragmatic, especially in long-running territorial conflicts. Trump's emerging Ukraine peace proposal appears to follow this same template: halt the fighting, freeze the lines of control, open negotiations with Russia, and push Europe to finance reconstruction. Whether one agrees with him or not, this framework reflects the same logic that guided his interventions in the Middle East, prioritizing de-escalation over idealistic nation building. 5. A peace policy rooted in domestic politics. Finally, Trump's peace posture is grounded in a political reality he understood earlier than most U.S. leaders. American voters do not want another forever war. His first-term restraint was not accidental. It was a response to the domestic exhaustion with costly, open-ended military engagements. That sentiment has only intensified today. His first-term record, imperfect yet unmistakably anti-interventionist, therefore forms the backbone of his new Ukraine peace push. Part 3, the emerging Trump peace formula and its geopolitical logic. As Trump's peace framework slowly takes shape, it becomes increasingly clear that his approach is built not on ideology, but on a hard-headed assessment of geopolitical realities that Washington's political class has long refused to confront. Trump is not a theorist. He is not a traditional diplomat, but he possesses an intuitive understanding of power, of what nations can and cannot realistically achieve that many establishment policymakers routinely ignore. To understand the logic of Trump's emerging peace formula, we must analyze 3 layers: America's limits, Ukraine's long-term viability, and Russia's strategic calculus. 1. The recognition of American fatigue and strategic overstretch. Trump's plan begins with a simple but powerful premise: the United States cannot and will not finance this war indefinitely. This is not a moral argument. It is a fiscal and political reality. U.S. voters are exhausted. Congress is fractured. The defense industrial base cannot produce enough ammunition to sustain a long conflict. And other crises, Taiwan, the Middle East, the southern border, are consuming Washington's attention. Trump understands what the Pentagon has privately admitted: a prolonged war in Ukraine drains American bandwidth and weakens the U.S. strategic posture globally. His peace formula, therefore, begins where all rational policymaking begins with a sober accounting of national limits. 2, acknowledging the military stalemate. Contrary to maximalist narratives circulating through Western capitals, Ukraine cannot militarily recapture Crimea or the heavily fortified territories Russia now holds. The battlefield reality is clear. Russia possesses deeper manpower reserves. Its defense industry has transitioned to wartime footing. It controls the escalation ladder, and its strategic depth dwarfs Ukraine's. Trump's team recognizes this. A military route to Ukrainian victory is not feasible, not without U.S. troops, which neither political party is willing to send. Thus, from Trump's perspective, the rational path is to negotiate from the battlefield as it exists, not as Washington wishes it were. 3, a controlled freeze of the front line. Trump's emerging strategy resembles a classic armistice model similar to the Korean Peninsula, Cyprus, or post-Dayton Bosnia. Immediate ceasefire, freezing lines of control, negotiations on political status, and an international monitoring mechanism. Critics call this rewarding Russia, but Trump views it differently. It prevents Ukraine from collapsing and ends the open-ended bleeding of American resources. It creates stability where chaos has become the norm. More importantly, it allows Ukraine to rebuild instead of continually absorbing military strikes. 4, economic reconstruction as leverage. Trump understands something fundamental: wars end when economic incentives outweigh military ambitions. His formula uses reconstruction funds as a bargaining chip. Russia receives sanctions relief in phases tied to compliance. Ukraine gains security guarantees and investment packages from Europe and the US. Europe becomes the primary economic supporter, no longer the passive observer relying on American subsidies. It is transactional diplomacy, not poetic diplomacy, but it is also realistic diplomacy. 5, limiting NATO's encroachment without abandoning Ukraine. A core element of Trump's logic is stabilizing Europe, not expanding military blocs. His proposal does not abandon Ukraine, as critics claim. Instead, it focuses on security neutrality, the only arrangement historically capable of balancing Ukraine's position between NATO and Russia. This echoes long-standing diplomatic ideas from Henry Kissinger to European analysts that were ignored in the years leading to the 2022 escalation. 6, realigning Europe's strategic responsibilities. Europe has long outsourced its security to Washington. Trump's formula forces a fundamental shift. Europe finances reconstruction. Europe manages long-term security guarantees. Europe becomes the stabilizer of its own region. In Trump's geopolitical calculus, this is not merely desirable, it is necessary. The United States must prioritize Asia, where long-term competition with China will define global power in the 21st century. Set a peace built on realism, not illusion. Trump's peace architecture, still unfolding, challenges the ideological rigidity that has dominated Western policy. It accepts limits. It recognizes spheres of influence. It prioritizes stability over maximalist aims. It reframes Ukraine not as a battleground of empires, but as a future bridge between them. Whether one agrees or disagrees, the internal logic of the plan is clear. It prioritizes de-escalation, reconstruction, and geopolitical balance, 3 elements Washington desperately needs but rarely acknowledges. Europe's reaction to Trump's emerging peace architecture is shaped by fear, dependency, and geopolitical uncertainty. The continent has become the reluctant stakeholder in a war it cannot control, yet cannot afford to ignore. As Trump signals the possibility of a negotiated end, Europe finds itself confronting uncomfortable questions about its own strategic autonomy, and its long-standing reliance on American leadership, I have spent decades watching the transatlantic alliance shift through crises, and rarely has Europe been so divided, so anxious, and so unprepared for strategic responsibility. One, Europe's strategic anxiety, fear of abandonment. European states, especially Poland, the Baltics, and parts of Scandinavia, view Trump's peace initiative not as diplomacy, but as a potential American retreat. For them, the war in Ukraine is not an abstract geopolitical contest. It is an existential threat. This anxiety manifests in three ways: fear that Trump will force Kyiv into concessions that Europe is not prepared to publicly endorse; fear that U.S. military support will be reduced effectively, leaving Europe alone with a powerful and assertive Russia; fear that Europe's eastern frontier will become unstable if negotiations freeze rather than resolve territorial disputes. These states believe deterrence must be absolute, uncompromising, and backed by unlimited American resources, a belief Trump fundamentally rejects. Two, Western Europe's realism, quiet acceptance behind public posturing. Germany, France, Italy, and Spain view Trump's approach differently. They may publicly defend Ukraine's maximalist goals, yet privately they understand the war is unwinnable militarily. Europe lacks the industrial capacity to sustain Ukraine long-term, and domestic support for continued escalation is collapsing. European economies are already under strain from high energy costs, inflation, and reduced competitiveness. For Western Europe, Trump's peace formula offers something they desperately need: an exit ramp, even if they cannot politically admit it. Thus, while Eastern Europe reacts with panic, Western Europe reacts with pragmatic resignation. Three, NATO's dilemma: unity in words, division in strategy. NATO has entered a paradoxical phase. It speaks with one voice publicly, but in private, its members pursue divergent goals. Trump's approach exacerbates this split. His willingness to negotiate with Moscow undermines NATO's maximalist messaging. Yet many NATO states quietly welcome the possibility of stabilization, even if it means territorial compromises. This raises a deeper question: can NATO survive as a unified alliance if its members fundamentally disagree about the war's endgame? Trump's peace plan may become the catalyst that exposes these fractures. Four, Europe's dependence on the United States, a critical weakness exposed. For decades, Europe has spoken of strategic autonomy, but the Ukraine war has revealed the opposite. Europe depends on U.S. ammunition, U.S. intelligence, U.S. satellites, U.S. financial support, and U.S. military logistics. Without Washington, Europe cannot sustain Ukraine for even 6 months. The European defense industry remains fragmented and underfunded. This dependency gives Trump extraordinary leverage. If the U.S. shifts direction, Europe will be forced to adapt no matter the rhetoric or resistance. Five, the emerging power shift from American primacy to shared responsibility. Trump's peace framework pushes Europe towards something it has long avoided: taking responsibility for its own security architecture. This shift includes Europe financing the long-term reconstruction of Ukraine, Europe designing a security arrangement that does not rely on U.S. intervention, Europe balancing its relationship with Russia and China independently of Washington. This is not a downgrade of the transatlantic alliance. If executed wisely, it is a maturation, but it requires Europe to recognize its own limitations and develop coherent regional strategies. Six, the deep philosophical divide between Trump and Europe. Europe's leaders still cling to a liberal internationalist worldview in which peace is achieved through universal values and institutional frameworks. Trump rejects this entirely. His worldview is transactional, Darwinian, and deeply realist. Nations have interests, not ideals. Security is defined by capabilities, not promises. Peace emerges not from moral appeals, but from negotiated balances of power. This philosophical divide will shape Europe's reaction to Trump's initiative more than any tactical disagreement. 7. Europe at a crossroads. Trump's peace initiative forces Europe to choose between two futures. 1. Continue relying on American leadership, even if U.S. priorities shift toward Asia domestic politics or disengagement from conflict. 2. Develop independent strategic capacity, accepting the financial and political cost of autonomy. Most European governments want option 1, but geopolitical reality is pushing them toward option 2. Trump's emerging peace formula, therefore, represents not only a potential turning point in the Ukraine war, but a decisive moment for the future of Europe itself. As I reflect on the broader geopolitical implications of Trump's emerging peace strategy, it becomes clear that its influence would extend far beyond the borders of Ukraine. A U.S. engineered ceasefire, or even the framework for one, would reshape global alignments, reconfigure international power balances, and redefine America's relationship with Russia, China, and Europe. In many ways, this peace initiative represents the most significant recalibration of U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. 1. A reorientation of U.S.-Russia relations. A successful peace plan would mark the first serious U.S.-Russia diplomatic engagement in years. The confrontation that began in 2014 and escalated sharply in 2022 has frozen relations into a zero-sum standoff. Trump's approach, whether one agrees with his methods or not, attempts to reintroduce strategic dialogue into a relationship defined by hostility. Key consequences include stabilizing nuclear risk, which has quietly escalated to the highest levels since the 1,980 seconds, restarting arms control conversations, which are currently non-existent, reducing Russian dependency on China, a dependence created largely by Western overreach. Washington may find that diplomacy with Moscow not only reduces European risks, but increases American leverage in other strategic arenas. 2, China's strategic position, the quiet winner or the cautious observer. China watches the conflict with deep strategic interest. A prolonged war weakens Europe, drains U.S. resources, and pushes Russia deeper into China's sphere of influence. A Trump-brokered peace deal would complicate China's long-term strategy of benefiting from Western distraction, strengthen Russia's autonomy, giving Moscow more room to maneuver between Beijing and Washington, open the door to trilateral diplomacy, an uncomfortable yet potentially stabilizing development. China's reaction would likely be pragmatic rather than ideological. A stable Eurasia is economically beneficial for Beijing, but a strong U.S.-Russia rapprochement may pose strategic constraints. Thus, China will support peace, but on terms that preserve its influence. 3. The rebalancing of NATO and the end of automatic alignment. NATO has relied for decades on the predictable continuity of U.S. foreign policy. Trump disrupts that assumption. A peace framework negotiated by his administration could split NATO between hawks and realists, force Europe to define its long-term defense posture, reduce NATO's operational centrality if the U.S. shifts strategic focus away from Europe toward Asia. This does not mean NATO collapses, Rather, it evolves into a more politically pluralistic and less U.S.-centric alliance. 4. The Global South, a validation of multipolar diplomacy. Across Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, the Ukraine war has been seen not as a moral battle, but as a geopolitical stalemate between great powers. Trump's peace initiative, if it prioritizes negotiation over escalation, would strengthen the position of countries advocating neutrality. Key implications include increased diplomatic space for non-aligned states, a shift away from Western moral absolutism, greater acceptance of multipolar conflict resolution mechanisms. For much of the Global South, peace through negotiation confirms what they have argued. Since 2022, conflicts of great power rivalry require political solutions, not military fantasies. 5. Energy and commodity markets, a global economic realignment. The Ukraine conflict radically reshaped global energy flows. A reduction in hostilities would trigger lower energy prices, easing inflationary pressures worldwide. Stabilization of grain and fertilizer markets, particularly critical for Africa and South Asia. Renewed Russian participation in global supply chains, reducing volatility. This is perhaps the most immediate geopolitical dividend, a calmer economic environment, especially for vulnerable economies. 6. A reassessment of America's global role. If Trump's peace plan succeeds, it signals a monumental shift in U.S. strategy from armed management of conflicts toward negotiated power balancing. This would reshape global perceptions of America. Some allies may see it as a retreat. Others will view it as a long overdue realism. Rivals will interpret it as an opportunity and a warning. Above all, it marks a departure from the bipartisan interventionist mindset that has shaped American foreign policy for 3 decades. 7. The world after the deal, a less militarized, more competitive, more negotiated global order. A Trump-led peace initiative does not guarantee global harmony, nor does it signal the end of geopolitical rivalry, but it does introduce a different logic. Conflicts are to be managed, not endlessly inflamed. Diplomacy returns to the center of statecraft. Regional powers regain responsibility for their own security landscapes. In this sense, the geopolitical consequences of such a peace deal would be profound, enduring, and potentially stabilizing if the world's major actors can accept a new balance of interests rather than chase the illusions of absolute victory. As I bring together the threads of this analysis, I return to a central truth. The war in Ukraine is no longer sustainable, neither militarily, economically, nor politically for any of the major actors involved. What we are witnessing today is not simply diplomatic movement nor an isolated American recalibration, but the emergence of a strategic recognition shared in Washington, Moscow, and increasingly across Europe. The conflict must be brought to an end. The presence of U.S. military officials in Ukraine during the early framing of Trump's peace plan underscores the seriousness of this moment. Washington is not withdrawing. Rather, it is preparing to reshape the conflict's trajectory. In my view, this reflects 2 converging realities: U.S. fatigue with indefinite support and Ukrainian exhaustion after years of attrition. At the same time, Russia has reached a point of consolidation, not expansion, a point where negotiation becomes strategically rational. Against this backdrop, Europe, divided, economically strained, and electorally fragmenting, struggles to maintain alignment with Washington's shifting priorities. The path to peace, therefore, requires a broad synthesis of interests. 1, a realistic territorial framework No peace deal can proceed without addressing the territorial question honestly. A successful plan must acknowledge that Ukraine will not return to its 2014 borders through military means, while ensuring that Ukraine retains sovereignty, security guarantees, and the right to political self-determination. I recommend a phased sovereignty model with internationally supervised referendums at a later date, not under conditions of war. 2, a permanent ceasefire and demilitarized line. A sustainable peace requires a monitored buffer similar to the Korean model, but adapted to modern European security structures. This is distasteful to maximalists on both sides, yet it remains the only viable path to stability. 3, neutrality or conditional NATO arrangement. Ukraine must have security, but not through outright NATO expansion. Instead, a status akin to Austria or Finland during the Cold War armed neutrality, supported by international guarantees, would satisfy 2 imperatives: Ukraine's safety, Russia's need for reduced NATO military pressure. Only such a middle position can bridge the strategic divide. 4, massive reconstruction program. A European, American, Asian reconstruction fund is essential. Ukraine's future must not mirror the stagnation of post-war Iraq or the fragmentation of Libya. A Marshall Plan-style initiative would stabilize Ukraine, reduce migration pressure, improve European economic confidence, undermina extremism. Peace without reconstruction is merely a pause before renewed conflict. 5, reopening U.S.-Russia strategic dialogue. The war has derailed essential global cooperation, energy stability, nuclear arms control, climate agreements, and the functioning of multilateral institutions. A Trump-led peace plan, if executed pragmatically, could reopen channels for New START renewal, Arctic cooperation, cybersecurity agreements, anti-terrorism coordination. These mechanisms are indispensable for global stability. 6, Europe's role from follower to co-architect. Europe must abandon its reactive posture. If the United States shifts course under Trump, Europe cannot remain trapped in the logic of escalation. Instead, Europe should advocate for diplomacy, participate fully in reconstruction, reduce strategic dependence while avoiding confrontation, rebuild relations with the global South. European credibility depends not on moral rhetoric, but on pragmatic leadership. 7, final reflection. At its core, the coming peace initiative is not about Trump, Biden, Zelensky, or Putin. It is about recognizing that the era of endless proxy warfare has reached its limits. The world is entering a multipolar period in which stability cannot be imposed militarily, but must be negotiated, carefully built, economically, and maintained through shared political responsibility. If Washington, Moscow, Kyiv, and Europe can accept a future defined not by maximalist ambitions, but by balanced coexistence, then peace, true peace, may finally begin to take shape.